The rope burned against her wrists as they dragged her through the mud of Salem's outskirts. Clara Whitmore's bare feet stumbled over stones, her healing satchel torn from her shoulder and scattered across the October ground. Dried herbs floated in puddles like forgotten prayers. "Witch!" The word cut through the morning air sharper than any blade. Margaret Henley's voice rose above the crowd, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. "She touched my dying baby, and now he breathes. No mortal woman has such power." Clara's green eyes met the mob's fury without flinching. She had saved the Henley child from fever, with willow bark and gentle hands, the same way her grandmother had taught her, the same way she had healed dozens of others in this ungrateful town. "I used only God's plants," Clara whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. Nothing more. But fear had already poisoned their hearts. The minister's wife had died last winter despite Clara's efforts, and now every healing was seen as darkness, every life saved as proof of unholy bargains. They bound her to the whipping post in the town square. The first lash split her homespun dress, the second drew blood. Clara bit her tongue, tasting copper and determination. She would not give them the satisfaction of her screams. From the crowd's edge, a figure watched in silence. Thomas Brennan leaned heavily on his walking stick, his left leg forever changed by Confederate bullets at Gettysburg. His weathered face remained expressionless as the leather cracked against Clara's back, but his knuckles whitened around the carved handle of his cane. 20 lashes. The crowd dispersed, satisfied with their righteousness. Clara hung against the post, her dark hair matted with sweat and tears she refused to shed. Blood soaked through her torn dress, mapping rivers of injustice across her pale skin. "You have until sunset to leave Salem," the constable announced, cutting her bonds. "Show your face here again, and we'll finish what we started." Clara collapsed to her knees, her hands finding purchase on the rough wood. She tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her. The crowd had taken everything, her home, her reputation, her purpose. Even the herbs she had carefully dried for winter medicine lay trampled in the dirt. As darkness approached, she crawled toward the forest's edge. Better to die among the trees than give them another moment's entertainment. The October wind cut through her ruined dress, carrying the scent of wood smoke and her own blood. That's when she heard the steady rhythm of a walking stick against stone. Thomas Brennan emerged from the shadows, his Union Army coat faded but clean, his beard streaked with premature gray. He stopped 3 feet away, studying her with eyes that had seen too much death to fear a broken woman. "Can you walk?" His voice carried the weight of command, softened by something deeper. Clara lifted her chin, pride warring with desperation. "I can manage." "No," he said simply. "You can't." Without another word, he shed his coat and placed it over her shoulders. The wool still held his warmth, smelling of pipe tobacco and honest labor. He helped her to her feet, his calloused hands gentle against her torn skin. "My farm is a mile north," he said, supporting her weight without comment. "No one will look for you there." Clara studied his face in the dying light. "Why would you help me? They'll call you witch friend." Thomas's laugh held no humor. "They already call me worse things. A man who fought for the Union in these parts learns to live with whispers." Together they walked into the gathering darkness, leaving Salem's hatred behind. Clara's bare feet found easier purchase on the forest path, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Thomas Brennan's farm stretched across 40 acres of Massachusetts countryside, bordered by stone walls older than memory. The house itself was modest, 2 stories of weathered clapboard with a wide porch that caught the morning sun. Clara's first glimpse came through fevered eyes as Thomas carried her across the threshold. "I can walk," she protested weakly, but her body contradicted her words. The infection from her wounds had set in during the night, leaving her burning with fever and shaking with chills. "Be still," Thomas said, settling her onto his own bed. The room was sparse but clean, a soldier's discipline evident in every corner. A single photograph sat on the nightstand, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Thomas noticed Clara's gaze. "My wife, Sarah, she died 3 winters ago, consumption." Clara's healer's instincts stirred despite her weakness. "I'm sorry, I might have helped her if I'd known." "Maybe." Thomas pulled a quilt over her shivering form. "But you're in no condition to help anyone right now." For 3 days, Clara drifted between fever dreams and waking moments. Thomas tended her wounds with surprising gentleness, cleaning them with boiled water and applying poultices of his own crude making. He fed her broth when she could manage it, and changed her bandages without comment or judgment. On the 4th morning, Clara woke to find sunlight streaming through clean windows. The fever had broken, and her back, while still painful, no longer felt like fire. Thomas sat in a chair beside the bed, whittling a piece of pine. "You stayed," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Where else would I go? It's my house." Despite everything, Clara smiled. "You know what I mean." Thomas set down his knife. "I've seen enough good people destroyed by fear and ignorance. Seemed like a waste to let it happen again." Clara struggled to sit up, wincing at the pull of healing skin. "The townspeople will talk. A war veteran harboring an accused witch. Let them talk. I stopped caring about other people's opinions when I watched my friends die for causes they barely understood." Over the following weeks, Clara discovered the rhythm of Thomas's life. He rose before dawn to tend his small herd of cattle, worked his fields with methodical precision, and spent evenings reading by lamplight. His left leg pained him constantly, a reminder of Pickett's charge, but he never complained. Clara found ways to help despite her healing wounds. She cooked meals that actually tasted of something more than salt and survival. She mended his clothes with neat, careful stitches. Most importantly, she began to tend his hidden ailments. The headaches that plagued him, the persistent cough from too many nights sleeping in wet trenches. "You should let me look at that leg," she said one evening, as he rubbed his thigh with obvious pain. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I've lived with it this long. Living with pain isn't the same as living well." That night, Clara prepared a poultice of comfrey and willow bark, the same herbs that had damned her in Salem. Thomas submitted to her ministrations with obvious reluctance, but she felt his muscles relax under her skilled hands. "How did you learn all this?" he asked as she worked. "My grandmother. She was a healer before the word became synonymous with evil. She taught me that every plant has a purpose, every remedy a reason." Clara's hands stilled. "I used to believe that knowledge was a gift to be shared freely." "Used to? Now I wonder if some gifts are too dangerous to give." Thomas turned to face her, his eyes serious. "The danger isn't in the gift, Clara. It's in the fear of those who don't understand it." As autumn deepened into winter, Clara's wounds healed completely, leaving only faint scars as reminders of Salem's justice. But she found she had no desire to leave. Thomas's farm had become a sanctuary, and Thomas himself had become something she hadn't expected, a friend who saw her skills as blessing rather than curse. The townspeople of nearby Millbrook eventually learned of Clara's presence, but Thomas's reputation as a war hero preceded her infamy. When old Mrs. Patterson fell ill with pneumonia, her desperate son arrived at Thomas's door, hat in hand. "I know you got that woman staying here," he said, eyes downcast. "The one they say has abilities. My mother's dying and the doctor's given up." Thomas looked to Clara, who stood in the doorway with her healing satchel already in hand. "I'll come," she said simply. Mrs. Patterson lived, and word spread quietly through the farming community. Clara began to heal again, but differently now, with Thomas's protection and the grateful discretion of people who cared more about results than reputation. Winter's grip loosened slowly that year, ice giving way to mud season with reluctant grace. Clara had been at Thomas's farm for 6 months, and the rhythm of their shared life had settled into something comfortable, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. She stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas split wood in the yard. His movements were methodical, economical, a man who had learned to conserve his strength. The limp was less pronounced now, thanks to her nightly treatments, but she could still see the careful way he favored his left side. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Clara opened it to find a young woman clutching a bundle of rags, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. "Please," the woman gasped. "My baby, she's burning up. I heard that you could—" Clara didn't hesitate. She took the feverish infant into her arms, feeling the telltale heat of dangerous fever. The baby's breathing was shallow, labored. Without treatment, she would not survive the night. "Thomas," Clara called, her voice steady despite the urgency. "I need hot water and clean cloths, quickly." Thomas appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with a soldier's quick assessment. He asked no questions, simply moved to help. This was how they worked now, in perfect synchronization, each understanding their role. Clara laid the baby on the kitchen table, her hands already reaching for her healing herbs. Willow bark for fever, elderberry for the chest congestion, chamomile to soothe the infant's distress. Her fingers moved with practiced certainty, measuring and mixing with the precision of a lifetime's training. "What's her name?" Clara asked as she worked. "Mary," the young mother whispered. "After my own mother, God rest her soul." Clara smiled, her first genuine smile in months. "Mary's a strong name. She'll fight this fever." For the next 6 hours, Clara worked tirelessly. She bathed the baby in tepid water to break the fever, administered tiny doses of her herbal preparations, and held the child against her chest so Mary could feel the steady rhythm of a healthy heart. Thomas remained nearby, fetching whatever Clara needed, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of medical crisis. He had seen field surgeons work on battlefield casualties, but there was something different about watching Clara heal, something that spoke of life preserved rather than death delayed. As dawn approached, the baby's fever broke. Her breathing deepened, and color returned to her small face. The young mother wept with relief, pressing Clara's hands to her lips in gratitude. "How can I repay you?" she asked. "Live well," Clara replied. "Raise your daughter to be kind. That's payment enough." After the woman left, Clara sank into a chair, exhaustion finally claiming her. Thomas poured her a cup of coffee, his movements careful and deliberate. "You saved her life," he said simply. "We saved her life," Clara corrected. "I couldn't have done it alone." Thomas studied her over the rim of his cup. "You're different when you're healing, like you become exactly who you're meant to be." Clara's throat tightened. "In Salem, they said I was an abomination, that my gifts came from darkness. In Salem, they were fools." Thomas's voice carried quiet conviction. "I've seen real darkness, Clara. I've seen men do things that would make devils weep. What you did tonight, that was pure light." Word of baby Mary's recovery spread through the farming community with the speed of hope long deferred. Within days, Clara found herself treating a steady stream of patients, farmers with infected wounds, children with consumption, elderly women whose bones ached with the memory of harder times. Each healing brought vindication, but also danger. The broader world beyond their small community still whispered of witches and dark arts. Clara knew it was only a matter of time before those whispers reached the wrong ears. The reckoning came on a Tuesday morning in late March. Clara was tending to Thomas's vegetable garden when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. She looked up to see 6 men in dark coats, their faces grim with purpose. "Clara Whitmore," the lead rider called out. "By order of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you are under arrest for the practice of witchcraft and corruption of the innocent." Clara's blood turned to ice. They had found her. Despite Thomas's protection, despite the grateful families she had helped, the long arm of superstition had finally reached their sanctuary. Thomas emerged from the barn, his rifle cradled casually in his arms. His face was calm, but Clara recognized the dangerous stillness that had once made him a formidable soldier. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of command, "I believe you're trespassing on private property." The lead constable shifted uncomfortably. "We have a warrant, Mr. Brennan. The woman is a known witch. She must answer for her crimes." "What crimes?" Thomas asked, his tone conversational but his grip firm on the rifle. "Saving sick children, healing the wounded. If that's witchcraft, then every army surgeon I served with was in league with the devil." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Clara could see the calculation in the constable's eyes. Was apprehending one woman worth confronting a war veteran with a reputation for deadly accuracy? "Stand down, Thomas," Clara said quietly. "I won't have blood shed on my account." But Thomas didn't move. "No one takes you from this farm without going through me first." The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat. Clara realized with stunning clarity that this man, this scarred, quiet veteran, was prepared to die for her. Not from romantic love, but from something deeper, The absolute conviction that some things are worth fighting for. "We'll be back," the lead constable said finally, pulling his horse around, with more men and proper authority. As the riders departed, Clara turned to Thomas with tears in her eyes. "Why? Why would you risk everything for me?" Thomas lowered his rifle, his expression softening. "Because everyone deserves a chance to use their gifts without fear. Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and let evil triumph." He paused, then added quietly, "And because in 6 months, you've given me more reasons to live than I've had in 3 years. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of connection that went deeper than gratitude or companionship. She had found not just sanctuary, but home. The morning mist clung to the valley like a prayer as Clara walked the familiar path to Thomas's grave. 23 years had passed since that confrontation with the constables, 23 years of life lived fully and without apology. Her hair, once dark as autumn nights, now carried silver threads like spider silk in lamplight. She knelt beside the simple granite marker, her arthritic hands placing fresh wildflowers against the stone. "The Morrison baby was born healthy last week," she said softly, continuing their eternal conversation. "A girl. They named her Sarah, after your first wife. Said it was only fitting, since I learned my gentleness from watching how you spoke of her." The cemetery was quiet except for the whisper of wind through the oak trees Thomas had planted 40 years ago. Clara had chosen this spot for him, overlooking the farm they had built together, the fields that had fed dozens of families, the home that had sheltered countless souls seeking healing. She settled more comfortably against the headstone, her back protesting the movement. At 78, her body was finally admitting to the accumulated weight of years spent bending over sickbeds and grinding herbs in the darkness before dawn. "Dr. Harrison came by yesterday," she continued, her voice carrying the comfortable cadence of long practice. "The new physician from Boston. He wanted to know about the pain remedy I've been using for the veterans meeting. Said he'd never seen anything work so well for old war wounds." Clara smiled, remembering the young doctor's eager questions. Times had changed since her days as an accused witch. The world had grown more accepting of what it couldn't immediately understand, more willing to let results speak louder than superstition. "He asked me to write down my recipes," she said, brushing a leaf from Thomas's headstone. "All of them. Said they should be preserved for future healers. I told him I'd been carrying my grandmother's knowledge for 60 years, and perhaps it was time to let it serve more than just our little corner of Massachusetts." A flutter of movement caught her eye. A small sparrow had landed on the headstone, its head tilted with curious intelligence. Clara held perfectly still, not wanting to disturb the moment. "Remember when you used to say I was different when I was healing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were right, but you were wrong about one thing. I wasn't becoming who I was meant to be. I was becoming who I was meant to be with you." The sparrow chirped once, then flew away toward the farmhouse. Clara watched it go, her heart full of gratitude for the life she had been given. Not the life she had planned, that had ended in Salem's town square, but the life she had built from the ashes of injustice and fear. She remembered the morning the constables had returned, 6 months after their first visit. They had come with twice as many men and official papers bearing the governor's seal, but they had also come to find a community that had closed ranks around their healer, farmers who owed their children's lives to Clara's gentle hands. Thomas had stood on the porch, his rifle within easy reach, while Clara treated old Mr. Peterson's infected leg wound. The constables had demanded her immediate arrest, but their authority had crumbled against the quiet testimony of grateful families. "This woman saved my grandson," Mrs. Elliot had said, stepping forward with her walking stick. "If you take her, you take the only hope this valley has for surviving the next hard winter." One by one, the families had spoken, not with grand speeches or dramatic declarations, but with the simple truth of lives saved and suffering eased. The constables had left empty-handed, and no official warrant had ever been issued again. Clara had realized then that she had found something more valuable than sanctuary. She had found a place where her gifts were not just tolerated, but treasured, where healing was seen as blessing rather than curse. The years that followed had been the best of her life. She had worked alongside Thomas, turning their farm into a refuge for anyone seeking healing. They had married in the spring of 1876, a quiet ceremony in their own parlor, with only a few friends as witnesses. Clara had kept her own name, a small act of independence that Thomas had supported without question. "So you gave me 23 years, Clara said to the headstone, her voice thick with emotion. 23 years of waking up next to someone who believed in my purpose. 23 years of healing without fear, of using my gifts to serve rather than survive." She rose slowly, her joints protesting but her spirit undaunted. At the cemetery gate, she paused to look back at Thomas's grave, remembering their last conversation. He had been dying slowly, his war wounds finally claiming their victory, and she had been powerless to stop it. "I'm not afraid," he had whispered, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I've had more good years than any man deserves, and I know you'll keep healing long after I'm gone." Clara had wanted to protest, to fight against the inevitable, but Thomas's calm acceptance had taught her a final lesson about the limits of her gifts. Sometimes the greatest healing came not from preventing death, but from helping someone face it with dignity and peace. "The new doctor wants to establish a proper medical school," Clara said to the wind, knowing somehow that Thomas could hear her. "He says my knowledge combined with modern techniques could train a generation of healers. I told him I'd consider it, but only if they promised to remember where the real healing comes from." She walked slowly back toward the farmhouse, her steps steady despite the arthritis that plagued her joints. The morning sun painted the fields gold, and she could see smoke rising from the chimney where her current patient, a young mother with consumption, was resting in the same bed where Clara had once recovered from Salem's justice. The circle was complete, but the work continued. Clara had learned that healing was not just about curing bodies. It was about transforming fear into hope, ignorance into understanding, hatred into compassion. She had been accused of witchcraft for healing the sick, but she had been saved by a man who saw her gifts as divine rather than demonic. Together, they had built something that would outlast both of them. A legacy of healing that would ripple through generations, touching lives they would never know, carrying forward the simple truth that love and knowledge, combined with courage, could overcome any darkness. As Clara reached the farmhouse, she paused on the porch where Thomas had once stood guard against her accusers. The young mother appeared in the doorway, her color already improved after just 2 days of treatment. "How are you feeling today, Sarah?" Clara asked, using the name that had become common in their valley, a tribute to the woman whose memory had taught Thomas how to love again. "Better," the young woman said, her voice gaining strength. "Much better. Whatever you gave me, it's working." Clara smiled, remembering her grandmother's words from so long ago. "Every plant has a purpose, every remedy a reason, and every healer a calling to serve." She had been accused of witchcraft, but she had found something far more powerful, a life of purpose, love, and service that had transformed not just her own existence, but the lives of everyone she had touched. The healer's legacy lived on. That night, after spooning the last of the root broth into Sarah's lips and ensuring the young mother was wrapped warmly in quilts stitched decades ago, Clara settled into the worn rocking chair beside the hearth. The fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows across the room, its light etching deep lines across her weathered face. Outside, the wind sighed against the shutters, like a ghost knocking to be let in. But inside the farmhouse, time had stopped. Or rather, it had thickened, like syrup over a slow flame. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with memory, echoes of laughter, of quiet sobbing in the night, of whispered prayers and dying breaths. All of it hung in the air like the scent of lavender she used to cleanse the sick room. She had seen so many lives pass through these rooms, some mended by her hands, others carried gently into the next world. And though each departure had taken something from her, they had also given her something in return, a sacred understanding of mortality. As the flames dipped lower, Clara reached for the small journal on the side table, a battered leather-bound book whose pages were filled with ink, faded by time and oils from her fingertips. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile pages. This was not the book of her remedies that one had already been entrusted to Dr. Harrison for safekeeping. No, this was something different. This was her ledger of the lost. Each name inscribed was a person she had tended to, whether in life or in death. It was not a record of failure, nor was it a collection of guilt. It was a tribute, a ritual, a promise that no one would be forgotten. "Esther Whitmore," she whispered aloud, her voice no louder than the ticking of the old wall clock. "Died in childbirth, but her baby survived. I remember how she smiled when I told her she had a daughter. That was all she needed to hear." Clara closed her eyes. She could still see Esther's face, pale with the sheen of exertion and blood loss, but radiant in the candlelight. She had died with a whisper of joy on her lips. Clara had stayed with the child until the father could return from the lumber camps. That baby girl was now a teacher in the next county, last Clara heard. Next came Thomas Baird, a runaway soldier from the war who had stumbled into the valley half-starved and half-crazed. He had carried wounds no salve could heal, haunted eyes, sleepless nights, a fear of sudden sounds. Clara had given him a place to stay, and slowly, with tinctures of valerian and stories told by lamplight, he had started to sleep again. But his soul had remained fractured, and one spring morning he had walked into the river and never returned. "I planted willows where he was last seen," she murmured, brushing a fingertip over his name. "I wonder if they still cry for him." Clara knew some would find this morbid, even obsessive. But for her, the act of remembrance was a form of healing. Not just for the departed, but for herself. Every name she wrote was a thread in the tapestry of her life, binding her to something larger than loneliness. A sudden knock at the door pulled her from reverie. It was unexpected. Few visitors came after dark unless there was illness or birth. Clara rose slowly, her joints stiff, and opened the door to find a young man standing there, cloaked in snow and moonlight. His eyes were the pale grey of winter skies, and his hat trembled in his hands as if unsure of its place in this world. "Are you the healer?" he asked, his voice rough with either cold or fear. Clara nodded once, stepping aside to let him in. "My brother," he said as she helped him remove his coat. "He's burning with fever. Nothing we've tried has worked. They said you could help." Clara studied him. His clothes were plain but clean. His boots were cracked. She could smell desperation on him, the way one might detect smoke before seeing fire. "How far is your home?" 2 miles past the old mill." She nodded again. "You'll need to guide me. Give me 5 minutes." She gathered her pouch, already packed with essentials, and threw on her thick wool cloak. The familiar rhythm of crisis coursed through her veins like a second heartbeat. This was where she lived, not just in the safety of her home, but on the edge of suffering at the boundary between what could be saved and what must be let go. They set off into the night, their lantern bobbing in the dark like a lone firefly. The path was treacherous, the snow concealing roots and rocks, but Clara moved with surprising agility. She had walked harder trails for lesser reasons. As they reached the ridge overlooking the river, the young man turned to her suddenly. "People say you're not just a healer," he said hesitantly. "They say you know things that aren't written down." Clara said nothing for a long moment. She let the wind speak through the trees before answering. "I know that pain doesn't always live in the body," she said quietly, "and I know that healing doesn't always look like survival." He didn't respond, but she could see the tension leave his shoulders just a little. Sometimes the truth was the most terrifying medicine. When they arrived at the house, Clara wasted no time. The boy, no more than 12, was burning up, his skin hot and damp, his breathing ragged. She knelt by his bed, her fingers moving with practiced precision, checking his pulse, examining his pupils, lifting his tongue. Then she reached into her pouch and withdrew a tincture of elderflower and willow bark, mixed with a dash of feverfew. "Hold him upright," she instructed. The older brother obeyed, and Clara administered the drops. She placed a cold compress across the boy's chest, then began whispering the same chant her grandmother had used, a rhythm more than words, meant to calm the soul, even as the body fought to survive. Hours passed, the fire dimmed, but slowly the boy's breathing eased and the fever began to break. The older brother wept silently beside her, his gratitude too large for language. When Clara finally returned home just before dawn, exhausted and aching, she did not collapse into bed. Instead, she went to her journal and added 2 more names, one for the boy she had saved, and one for the brother who had not left him alone.